Hi, my name is Alesha Dean-Weathersby. I'm 17 years old and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm going into my senior year at Walled Lake Central High School, which is in the Walled Lake Consolidated School District. I'm also a social justice fellow through the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and I'm incredibly passionate about educational justice. I hate that the fate of a student's public school education seems to be contingent upon how much money their parents make. It's unfair that students in Grosse Pointe have access to indoor swimming pools and technology labs when students in Detroit, the city over, have crumbling buildings and a lawsuit about their right to literacy. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's go back to Walled Lake. I've gone to Walled Lake School since I was in kindergarten, and I've always felt very privileged to go to schools with adequate funding. This gave me dedicated teachers, well-funded activities, and multiple computer labs. But any inequalities that I may face at school don't come from a lack of funding. Growing up as a black student in a predominantly white school district, I've been conditioned to normalize inequalities without even realizing it. Since elementary school, my district has always talked about the importance of diversity, yet in my almost 13 years in the district, I can only think of 4 black staff members. But it doesn't really matter, I thought. When I was a sophomore, a white boy at my school wore some sort of Confederate flag paraphernalia every single day. Whether it was his backpack, his sweatshirts, the pins on his backpack, or the hat that he brought despite the no hat in school rule. I knew this was not okay. But he's not really worth my time, I thought. Every day on my way to 4th hour, I would pass a crowd of boys screaming the N-word at each other across the hallway. None of them were black. Though this was initially shocking, by the end of my freshman year, it didn't even faze me. There's really nothing I can do about it, I thought. But once I began preparing for this video, I started to re-examine my experiences. Why did I think this was all so normal? I reached a turning point, and I wasn't the only one with these experiences. I'm now joined by my friend Jordan Solomon, who I'm interviewing to hear about her experiences in Michigan's public schools.
Hi, my name is Jordan Solomon. I'm a rising junior at Grosse Pointe North High School. I use she, her, hers pronoun, and I'm 17 years old.
Have you always gone to Grosse Pointe Schools?
No, I first attended Grosse Pointe Schools my 10th grade year, and prior to that, I was in the Detroit public school system at Renaissance High School.
What do you think is the biggest difference being a black student at Renaissance versus in Grosse Pointe?
So at Renaissance, my race didn't really matter as much. I automatically fit in because most of the school was black as well. So when I went to Grosse Pointe, it was more, my race became more of an issue. I noticed pretty quickly that where I would be used to having friend groups with all different races, religions, at Grosse Pointe it wouldn't be the same. Most of the students had segregated friend groups. Being a black student meant more at Grosse Pointe North than it did at Renaissance.
Do you feel it's hard to connect with other students at Grosse Pointe because of your race?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there is some sort of disconnect, especially because my school tends to be very segregated and you don't often see people of different cultures and different races hang out with each other or just even become friends with each other.
So I know that there's an anonymous Instagram page by Black Grosse Pointe students. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So yeah, there's an Instagram page now where students of color, specifically black students, can go on and share their stories about racial incidents that they've had in Grosse Pointe. And the classes go all the way back to the early 2000s, and I think it's great because it's creating a place of support for these students who often don't share their stories and are fearing sharing their stories because the community often gives a lot of backlash. So yeah, I think that the Instagram page means a lot to the community because it's giving black students a platform to talk about their issues, and it's anonymous. So I think that people will be more willing to come forward and give support to one another.
Is there a lot of engagement on the page or a lot of hate comments?
No, there's more so support than anything. I personally haven't seen any hate comments, but from what I know, that it's usually the hate comments would come in private. In Grosse Pointe, racism is more hidden. It's not blatant, but it's definitely there.
Can you tell me about one of the stories that resonate with you?
So yeah, I think a couple of the stories resonate with me, mostly the ones dealing with administration, because I've seen myself teachers and administrators try to minimize situations of students of color.
Can you tell me about a time where you experienced inequalities at school?
So one thing that comes to mind is the lack of education about my culture, about African American history. I know that usually when we learn in English, it's maybe 1 week dedicated to African American literature. And often in classes like AP Lang, we read a lot about like the founding fathers, or just it's very limited history, and it's usually European history. But what I've noticed is we don't really get the full picture of things. For example, I learned about the Tulsa Massacre just this year, and it did not come from my education. It came from something I was researching online. And I just think that there's probably a lot more that we should be learning about that I haven't.
How do you think not learning about your history puts you at a disadvantage?
For anything, really. I think that lack of representation can be damaging, especially to young students. If you don't see people like you in the history books, if you don't learn about people like you, if you don't learn about their accomplishments, then you start to question yourself and think, well, maybe I don't have the ability to do this because of the way that I look.
Black students like Jordan and myself should not have to experience these things. I should not have to make excuses for not seeing representation within the staff in my district when representation helps marginalized people feel seen. I shouldn't have to make excuses for a boy wearing a symbol of slavery and oppression in a place where I'm supposed to feel safe. I'm done making excuses for inequalities that I and other students face. I challenge you all to do something about this. I challenge you to implement mandatory bias training for all students and staff. Schools can do this by having student-led sessions and encouraging dialogue. I challenge you to demand that all schools update their curriculum to be inclusive of all groups. Teachers can do this by choosing literature written by diverse authors. Every single student deserves to live in an environment where they can thrive.